Every wealth reset looks different, but the signs never change. The rich grow richer, savings vanish, bubbles expand until they burst. The 1929 crash punished reckless speculators. 2008 humbled Wall Street gamblers. Today, trillions are concentrated at the top again. Could the next reset be closer than anyone admits? 1. Declining savings. Every great financial collapse leaves behind warning signs, and one of the earliest, yet most ignored, is when people stop saving. But when you trace history, declining savings are almost always the first domino to fall. Let's rewind to the 1920s. The decade we romanticize as the Roaring Twenties was built on credit and optimism. Jazz clubs were full, new gadgets like radios and refrigerators spread across homes, and the stock market looked unstoppable. But beneath the glitter, Americans weren't saving. By the late 1920s, the household savings rate had dipped below 5%. Instead of saving, people borrowed heavily to buy stocks, on margin, sometimes putting down only 10% of the cost and borrowing the rest. By 1929, brokers had loaned more than $8 billion for margin buying, more than the total amount of currency in circulation at the time. When the market collapsed in October, families had no cash buffer. That's why a stock market crash snowballed into the Great Depression. Jump ahead to the early 2000s. Housing felt like the safest bet in the world. Prices never fall, people said. So instead of saving, Americans borrowed against their homes like piggy banks. Home equity loans and refinancing boomed. By 2005 to 2007, the U.S. personal savings rate hovered around 2%, the lowest in modern history. At the same time, household debt-to-income ratios reached nearly 130%. When housing prices cracked in 2008, millions of families were leveraged to the hilt, but with no savings to cushion the blow. The result? The deepest financial crisis since the 1930s. Now, look at today. After COVID hit in 2020, savings temporarily surged. Stimulus checks and lockdowns pushed the U.S. savings rate as high as 33% in April 2020. The highest ever recorded. Economists called it excess savings, but it didn't last. As inflation roared back, hitting 9.1% in June 2022, the highest since 1981, families dipped into those reserves just to cover rent, food, and energy. By 2023, the savings rate plunged back under 4%. Meanwhile, total household debt crossed $17 trillion, with credit card balances alone topping $1.1 trillion for the first time in history. The average credit card interest rate, over 22%, the highest since tracking began in 1994. And this isn't just an American problem. In the UK, savings rates collapsed before the 2008 crash, then again in 2022 as energy prices spiked. In China, households traditionally save 30% or more of income, a cultural habit born from weak social safety nets. But even there, debt levels are rising, and savings rates are slipping as young workers struggle with unemployment and high housing costs. Across Europe, households dipped into savings to cope with inflation after the Russia-Ukraine war drove up energy prices. The story repeats. When the cost of living soars faster than wages, savings vanish. Why does this matter so much? Because savings are the economy's shock absorbers. They give families resilience and create pools of capital that banks can lend productively. When savings vanish, households become brittle. One medical bill, one job loss, one rate hike, and the financial stability of millions can collapse overnight. As Manuel Ayau, the Guatemalan economist, would put it, saving isn't just about thrift. It's about creating capital that drives future production. Without it, economies stop investing in the future and start eating themselves alive. Which raises the unsettling question: if families today are saving less than they did before the last two great crises, what comes next? Because the next warning sign isn't about households at all. It's about corporations swimming in profits while the rest of the system grows fragile. 2. Rising corporate profits and asset bubbles. Every financial reset has a strangely predictable pattern. Right before the collapse, corporate profits and asset prices look unstoppable. It's the moment of peak confidence, the so-called champagne years, when CEOs boast about record earnings, stocks reach dizzying heights, and people start saying the dangerous words, "This time is different." But history always punishes that illusion. Take the 1920s. Corporate America was booming. U.S. industrial output doubled between 1921 and 1929, and company profits soared by over 60% in that same period. The stock market reflected this frenzy. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, which stood at 63 in 1921, shot up to 381 by September 1929. A 500% increase in just 8 years. Newspapers wrote about a new era of prosperity. Ordinary people piled into stocks, convinced the good times would last forever. But by October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday, the bubble burst. The Dow lost almost 90% of its value in the next 3 years, wiping out trillions in today's dollars. All those record profits vanished like smoke. Fast forward to the early 2000s. The story repeated itself. From 2002 to 2006, U.S. corporate profits surged at one of the fastest rates in history, while the financial sector, banks, mortgage lenders, Wall Street firms, grew fat on subprime lending and complex derivatives. In 2006, the profits of the S&P 500 hit levels not seen since the 1960s. Meanwhile, housing prices turned into a speculative bubble. From 2000 to 2006, U.S. home prices doubled. Builders couldn't keep up. Everyone was flipping houses, and mortgage brokers joked they could get a loan for a dog. But when prices started to decline in 2007, the profits turned out to be nothing more than air. By 2008, Lehman Brothers collapsed, and global markets followed. Now, here's the uncomfortable part. We're living through another echo of that pattern today. Look at the numbers. Apple's market cap hit $3 trillion in 2022, the first company in history to do so. Microsoft isn't far behind at nearly $3 trillion. Together, just the top 5 companies in the S&P 500, Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and Nvidia, make up over 25% of the index. That kind of concentration hasn't been seen since the dot-com bubble. Corporate profits as a share of U.S. GDP reached 12% in recent years, close to all-time highs. Compare that to the 1960s, when it hovered around 6%. In other words, corporations are taking a bigger slice of the pie than ever. And it's not just tech. U.S. housing prices have ballooned again. The Case-Shiller National Home Price Index shows prices rising more than 40% between 2020 and 2023, fueled by near-zero interest rates and pandemic-era demand. Meanwhile, rents surged, with some cities like Miami seeing year-over-year increases of over 30%. That's bubble behavior. And when you mix that with trillion-dollar corporate valuations, it feels eerily like 1929 or 2007. Globally, it's the same tune. China experienced one of the largest property bubbles in human history. At its peak, real estate made up nearly 30% of China's GDP. Developers like Evergrande borrowed hundreds of billions, selling apartments before they were even built. But by 2021, the bubble began collapsing, leaving unfinished ghost cities across the country and rattling the entire global economy. So why does this keep happening? Because profits and bubbles create a feedback loop. When companies post record earnings, their stock prices surge. When stock prices surge, people feel wealthier and borrow or spend more. That extra spending props up corporate profits even further, inflating the cycle. But when the feedback loop reverses, the fall is brutal. The irony is that the champagne years always feel the most exciting. The lights are brightest, the headlines are glowing, and the rich seem untouchable. But history whispers the same warning. The party always looks brightest right before the lights go out. Which brings us to the final and most explosive sign before a wealth reset, when inequality stretches so far that society itself begins to snap. 3. Extreme inequality. When wealth piles too high at the very top, pressure builds underneath. History shows again and again. Extreme inequality is like dry tinder. All it takes is one spark, and the whole system catches fire. Look back at the 1920s. By 1929, the top 1% of Americans controlled nearly 40% of the nation's wealth. CEOs and financiers lived in mansions, drank champagne nightly, and speculated on stocks like it was a game. Meanwhile, half the country earned less than $1,500 a year, the bare minimum needed to live decently. Farmers were drowning in debt. Factory workers barely scraped by, but Wall Street bonuses hit record highs. Sound familiar? When the crash came, the people at the bottom had no cushion. Bread lines stretched for blocks, while the richest quietly bought assets for pennies. Jump to 2008, the housing bubble burst, and millions of middle-class families lost their homes. Foreclosures skyrocketed. At one point, nearly 10 million homes were in danger. But what happened on Wall Street? The year after the bailout, major banks paid out over $18 billion in bonuses. Goldman Sachs alone set aside $16 billion for compensation in 2009. Even as ordinary families were sleeping in cars, the inequality wasn't just financial, it was moral. People saw the game was rigged. And today, the wealth gap is wider than at almost any time in modern history. In the US, the top 10% of households now hold nearly 70% of all wealth. The top 1% alone owns more than the entire middle class combined. Meanwhile, Nearly 60% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck, according to a 2023 survey. In raw numbers, that's around 150 million people who couldn't cover an emergency expense without borrowing. Globally, the picture is the same. Oxfam reported that in 2020, during the pandemic, billionaires added over $3.9 trillion to their wealth, while hundreds of millions fell into poverty. Inequality. This extreme doesn't just strain wallets. It strains societies. In 18th century France, when aristocrats hoarded wealth while peasants starved, the tension exploded into revolution. In the late 1800s, the U.S. Gilded Age created fortunes for Rockefellers and Carnegies, while labor strikes and violent clashes broke out across the country. In both cases, the imbalance eventually forced change. Here's where Manuel Ayau's lens cuts through the noise. He argued that wealth resets aren't random punishment. They're corrections. When too much capital concentrates in speculation or unproductive hands, resets reallocate it. The Great Depression wiped out reckless margin traders but opened the way for industries like aviation and consumer goods to thrive. The 2008 crash destroyed toxic mortgage bets but fueled the rise of tech giants like Apple, Amazon, and Google. Each time, inequality sets the stage for a collapse, and the collapse redistributes resources to those who can use them more efficiently. But that doesn't make the pain less real. Resets crush middle-class families the hardest because they don't have the buffers the wealthy enjoy. Think about Argentina in the early 2000s. The country defaulted on $100 billion of debt, the largest in history at the time. Inflation wiped out savings overnight, and poverty doubled. The wealthy shifted money abroad, while ordinary workers carried the cost. That's the brutal side of resets. The rich may lose on paper, but the poor lose their security. Today, the warning signs are flashing. Executive pay has skyrocketed. CEOs in the US now earn 399 times the average worker, compared to just 20 times in the 1960s. At the same time, housing affordability is collapsing. In cities like San Francisco or London, even high earners struggle to buy homes. These imbalances can't stretch forever. At some point, history suggests, the system bends until it breaks. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this breakdown, subscribe for more deep dives into money, history, and hidden economic truths. Every video connects the dots, and the next one might reveal the clue you've been missing. Keep learning, keep watching.